Welcome to the OnTarget HTML5 website YouTube channel. The website is dedicated to teaching web development technologies in HTML5, HTML, CSS, CSS3, PHP, MySQL, Flash, and the XML scripting language. We'll soon be adding a section on JavaScript, so I hope you visit us at www.ontargethtml5.com. Welcome back to the HTML5 Essential Training Series. And in this tutorial, we're going to talk about the div element. We're actually going to talk about the div element and the span element as they pertain to designing our HTML5 and HTML4 pages. We've talked about numerous elements in HTML and HTML5 up to this point in our tutorials, but there's one element that we've seen but not really discussed yet. And it's a very important element in our learning HTML journey, and that is the div element. In an effective layout while designing HTML pages, each part of the page you want to format separately should be in a division. HTML5 has made this a little easier for us with the addition of some new semantic element tags that have been added to the scripting language. These new tags have now made the sectioning of our document a little less cumbersome, but they have not completely replaced the div tag. The new semantic tags that have been added are the header tag, which defines the masthead or header information on a page. We now have a footer tag, which defines the text at the bottom of the page. We have an article tag, which defines a block of text that represents a single article. We have an aside tag, which defines a block of text that's pertinent to the main discussion of that page. And we have a section tag, which defines a generic content or application section of our particular web page. These new structural elements are one of the key features in HTML5. But as a good developer, you need to understand how to use the div and the span tag elements before we move into using these new elements in HTML5. And that is what we're going to cover now. We will discuss much more about these new tags in future tutorials, but let me make something very clear. These additional tags will make indexing our sites more efficient, they'll enhance the SEO or search engine optimization of our websites, but they will not replace all the areas that we've used div tags in the past. Nor were they meant to. I've been engaged in numerous discussions on this very topic, and the vast majority of web developers are continuing to use the div tag to section out our web pages where new semantic tags just don't seem to fit. So div tag and the span element. So a div tag lets us divide a page into divisions that can be formatted and positioned using CSS and CSS3. And a span tag lets you identify text that's inside that block that you want to format with CSS and CSS3. And we're going to go through both of those in this tutorial. We're going to cover both aspects, both the div tag and the span tag. Because again, as we're building on this journey, I want you to understand what we're doing as we start to assemble these web pages. So let's look at a couple of examples of what we've just talked about in the presentation. Alright, so let's move into our development environment. You'll notice I've got my Apache servers running, my MySQL is running, so everything on my web server is doing as it's supposed to. Let's go ahead and bring up our text editor. I'm going to go ahead and bring up my browser. And this time I'm using the Safari browser. I like to kind of switch the browsers up so you know things are working as they should be. I have loaded my chapter 9_01.html file from the example exercise files. If you have a copy of that exercise file folder, if not, now would be a good time to pause the tutorial and go ahead and type this into your text editor. This is, by the way, the same template we've been using throughout all the other tutorials. And what I want to do is we're going to start off by going into this div element that we talked about in our presentation. So in the exercise files under example 2, the first thing I want to add is I want to add a div ID. So I'm going to go into my body tag and I'm going to copy or paste this div ID container, and right below that, actually a couple lines below it, I'm going to put in the closing div tag for this container. One thing that you'll find that most web developers do as they're setting up their web pages is they'll have one div that encompasses the entire page. And you're going to see why we do that in a minute, because we're going to actually make some positioning relative to that container. So if I tell my HTML tags, and this is the HTML, this is the actual complete size of that browser window. If I tell my container tag that I want you to be 80% in width, it's going to be 80% of the entire browser. And what I can do by using that container tag, I can put everything relative to the container itself. So our first div is a container tag. You'll also notice that I put comments at the end of that div saying where is the closing div that closes that particular div ID. And I do that for a reason. And it's not going to be very obvious inside the tutorials that we're doing, because our pages are not going to get really complex. They're not very complex until we get farther along in the tutorial, or probably in an advanced tutorial series. When you're designing live web pages, some of the pages can become tremendously complex. I have pages that are 4,000 and 5,000 lines long. If I didn't keep track of where these things were closing out, I would get extremely confused myself as I'm in there trying to either fix things, correct things, or change things, move things around. So I always tend to have my opening div tag, I immediately put in my closing div tag, and I mark it as to what it actually is closing. And this div tag is closing my container. All right, I'm going to go ahead and do a save as. Let's go ahead and save this as chapter 9 _02 in our example files folder. And again, we shouldn't see anything in our browser window yet. When I update, I'll go back. Let's go ahead and reload that number 2. But because we don't have anything in the body tag other than a div, we're not going to see anything yet. But the next thing I want to do is let's go ahead and move in, again, under example 2 in your exercise folder. Let's go ahead and inside of our container div, I actually want to put in another div ID called header. And you'll notice once again I've got an opening div, a closing div, and inside the div I actually have a heading now, H2, called the Coins of the US. And this is going to be our example site that we're going to build. It's going to be a coin website. I like to collect coins. So our sample site is going to be a coin website, but I mean all these principles are going to pertain to whatever site that you want to do. I do want you to notice that the div ID again is inside of our container div. So go ahead and save those changes. Now would also be a great time for you to pause the video if you need to go ahead and type this code in if you don't have access to the example files. I'm also going to go ahead and refresh my browser window, because now we should be able to see that heading, which we do. We have heading 2. One thing I do want to point out for this particular set of tutorials, I have cleaned out my CSS file. There's nothing in that CSS file. So until we go in and start formatting these divs, you're not going to see anything appear on the browser window except the text that we put in. So if you got that done, I want to go ahead and add one more div. And right below our header, where we closed out the header div, I want to add another div called a Content Div. And these are names that I, up until just about a year ago, I used consistently with every site that I built. I always had a header div. I always had a content div. With the new semantic tags that are available in HTML5, obviously, and it's going to be one of the things we're going to discuss in the next part of this tutorial, some of these div IDs are going to go away because we actually have tags now that will substitute for them. Some will be gone, some will not. And you'll see that as we move further along in this tutorial. Now again, good time to pause the video if you need to copy in that content from the div ID content. I'm going to go in and put one more div in. And right below where I ended that content div, I want to paste in another div called my footer div. And again, you'll notice I've got an opening tag and a closing tag. I've got an ID, and I've got some text inside that footer div. Don't worry too much about what these ID means yet. I'm going to explain these in the next part of this tutorial. So you should have all this information in. I want you to go ahead and save that information. It should be chapter 9 _02. When you refresh your browser window, you should now see the information that we've put into our template page. We've broken it down into 3 different divisions, and actually those divisions are encompassed in another division. And in a moment you're going to see why we do that, because in the next part of the tutorial we're actually going to address those divisions as to how big they are, where they are in reference to the other divisions, and we're probably going to change some background colors so you can see why we do these things or why we lay out the page the way we do with different divisions for different sections. So you can better visualize what we've just put together with our div tags inside the HTML document. I put together this little presentation. We built a container inside the HTML document, and inside that container we've put in a header div tag, we've actually put in a content div tag, and we've put in a footer div tag. And if you'll notice, they're all enclosed inside that container. It's important to understand that concept as we move forward, but visually, this is what we've just done with that HTML document. Alright, so picking up where we just left off, we've got our chapter 9 _02 HTML page set up and completed. You can see what we're seeing in our browser window when we refresh that screen. Basically, we're seeing the text that's appearing inside our HTML document, but no formatting. There's no real reason yet as to why we've done anything with these div tags, but we're going to work on that right now. Okay, so let's open up our main.css file, and now would be a good time for you to pause if you want to catch up with what I've typed. Basically what I've done is I've just put some comments in the top of the main CSS file, because this is the file now that we're going to start building as we start building our site. We're getting enough background knowledge now where we can actually start progressing along to start building this website. So the first thing I want to do is, I've told you since we began the tutorials 8 tutorials ago that every web browser has its own built-in default settings. It has built-in margins and built-in padding, and they're not always the same. So what we tend to do is we actually have some universal resets, CSS resets, that web developers use. Some of them can be extremely complex. Some of them can be very, very simple. I'm going to start out with something extremely simple for our particular training, basically just resetting all the margins and paddings using the universal selector, so that everything inside my default browsers, or inside the browsers, everything that has padding and margin by default is going to be set to 0. So I'm going to go into my exercise file under example 3. I'm going to grab this code, and I'm going to come to my CSS file, and I'm going to paste it in. And now would be a great time for you to pause your video if you need to, so you can type this in. This star is the universal selector, so it's going to select every element or every tag that makes up, for instance, my particular Safari browser, and set all the margins to 0 and all the paddings to 0 for that particular browser. And actually it's going to do this for every browser now that loads this file, that loads this main.css. Keep in mind that we're calling the main.css in our HTML document. So whenever we load this in a browser window, it should be loading this document. I'm going to go ahead and save these changes, and now you're going to see what I mean when I refresh the browser window, just how much stuff is set into this browser by default. So I'm going to go ahead and refresh that browser window, and look what's happened to our text. All the padding that was along the top and the left edge is gone. So everything now is butting up nice and cleanly against the upper left-hand corner. And all the spacing that was put into our elements between our headings and our paragraph tags, that's all been taken to 0. So now we can set everything up ourselves in our CSS file. So we've removed all the margins and paddings from everything that made up the defaults in the browser, which is actually kind of cool. I know you don't see that yet, but you will. Because as we start designing our own pages, we want to make certain that as we design a page, it looks the same in every browser. The way to do that is to make certain that we've taken out all the defaults from those browsers. Okay, now the next thing I want to do is I want to actually start addressing this container. I set this master container up here for a reason. So let's start addressing that container itself. And again, under example 3, in the exercise files, I'm going to go right below where we put our universal selector. I'm going to paste in, this is the ID tag. This is the container name. Remember, I told you this was an ID, and the name of the ID that we're addressing is container. Well, in CSS, that pound signal signifies ID, and the name of that ID is container. So what I'm telling you is that I want you to have a width of 500 pixels. And keep in mind now, the container, everything is inside our container. I want you to have a width of 500 pixels. I want to put a border around you of 2 pixels. I want you to be solid in blue. I want the height of that container to be automatic. In other words, if my text continues to grow, the height of that container will grow with it. So anything that's inside there will grow with it. So my height is automatic, and my background color is going to be a very, very light yellow. So if I save that change to my CSS file, and again, now would be a good time for you to pause if you need to type this in if you don't have access to the exercise files. Go ahead and refresh this browser window, and you'll notice now we see everything enclosed in a yellow box with that blue border around it. One thing I want you to notice about this, I'm going to go ahead and comment out that blue border. And it's not going to seem important right now, but as we start designing complex pages, it will be important. I gave this a width of 500 pixels, and I also gave my border a width of 2 pixels. So what's happened is I've gained 2 pixels on the right and left edges. So now that particular box is 504 pixels wide. When we start talking about the box model and we start talking about floating elements, these individual pixels become very important. So don't forget, this is adding to the width of this container. If I actually refresh this, now that I've remarked this out so it's no longer part of the CSS, I want you to watch the yellow box. It's going to shrink 4 pixels. Oops, let's save our changes. Did you see it move in? It moved in 4 pixels because, again, we took out that 2 pixels from the right and the left. All right, let's go ahead and save that change. One other thing I want to do before we move on to the next section of this particular tutorial is I want you to notice everything seems to be crunched up against that left edge. Even though my browser window can get bigger and bigger, it appears that because I've given this a limit of 500 pixels in width, it's just going to sit there. Well, there's a way that we can keep that centered on our screen. And if you look at example 4 in your exercise files, I'm going to add a couple of lines to the bottom of this container CSS, and I'm going to tell it I want the margin left to be auto and the margin right to be auto. And what that is going to do, it's going to allow my container to stay centered in my browser window, because I've told it you calculate the margin in left and right automatically based on the size of the browser window. So let's do a save all. Again, good time for you to pause if you need to type this in. I'm going to refresh this browser window, and you'll notice now that my yellow box with the border moved towards the center, and if I were to resize my browser, it's going to stay in the center, because we've told it, based on that margin left and margin right, to automatically calculate the distance on the right and the left and keep this box in the middle. Okay, so let's move on to the next portion. All right, so we've set up our container div. We've given it a width. We've given it a border. We've centered it in our browser page. It's kind of cool. But we still haven't really used these divs. I mean, we've got all these divs inside here and haven't really shown what the purpose of the divs are. So let's look at the header div next. And again, it's got an ID. We have a div with an ID of header. And we have this text, the coins of the US in it. So let's go back into that CSS sheet. And again, I know this is not a CSS training tutorial, but because of what we're doing with designing these web pages, we're going to cover quite a bit of CSS in this tutorial series. Now, to get down and dirty on CSS, I really recommend that you take some of the tutorials into the CSS section, because we're going to get really in depth in those tutorials that we wouldn't do in these. Okay, first thing I want to do, I want to go to my example files, my exercise files, under example 5, and I'm going to bring in right below my container ID, I am going to put in another ID for my header. And I'm going to give it a width of 80%, a background of 9F6, which, by the way, these are the color chart backgrounds for our web colors. You can actually download a web color sheet from the site. In fact, I may actually post one on our site right here. And I'm giving it, the actual header itself, a height of 30 pixels. So we're actually going to start out by giving it a green background color, a width of 80%, a height of 30 pixels, and keep in mind that this width is relative to this. Because the header is inside my container, all the sizing that I'm doing for it are relative to the container itself. So my 80% is going to be 80% of this 500 pixels. And I'll demonstrate that as we move further along in the tutorial. Let's go ahead and save those changes. Now would be a great time for you to pause your video if you need to and get these into your text editor. When I go ahead and refresh my browser window, you'll notice now I've got Coins of the US. It has a background of green. It appears that the width of this is about 80% of the width of my container, my yellow container. And by the way, that's the only reason I'm using these colors. On a real website, I would not use these very contrasting colors, obviously. I'm using this so you can see what we're doing. Okay, kind of cool. So now I've got this header. It's got a background of green, but I want to add some more pizzazz to it. So what I want to do, again, in my example 5 exercise file, I'm going to go ahead and grab this border bottom, and I'm actually going to put a bottom border on this particular div tag. I want to give it a border bottom that's 2 pixels wide. I want it to be dashed, and it's going to be a light gray. So I'm going to save those changes, refresh my browser, and now we've added a border just to the bottom of that particular header element, or that header ID. Remember, all we're addressing now based on the CSS is everything that's inside this header ID. So this is what we're actually working with right now. And just like we talked about earlier, I mean, I want to get that text. I don't want the text to be flushed up against that left edge. I mean, it just doesn't look right. It should be somehow centered inside that green box. Well, CSS gives us the capability of doing that by just adding a text align to our CSS. So I'm going to say text align center. So any text that's inside that header div, you're going to align it to the center. Go ahead and save that change. Update my browser window. Now our text has moved to the center. So you can see we have all this stuff going on now through our CSS, through our styling sheet. And you can see why we use CSS to style. HTML is for our structural markup. The structure of the site, CSS is for our styling. And there's one other thing I want to do, and I'm hoping if you remember from the previous discussion we had on container, I actually want to center this inside that container. And guess what? We center this just the exact same way that we centered the container. We come right down below here and we put in margin left and margin right auto, and that should calculate the distance between the edges of the container for our 80%. So when I save this and I save or update my browser, now we've had that jump to the center of the page. And it's going to stay centered. As I move this browser around, it's going to stay centered in that page. What's really cool, and you're going to find this out as we get into dynamic websites, if I wanted to make this container 80%, and let's just do that real quick and we'll change it back, because I actually left it at 500 pixels so we can have this dual development background. So I got the browser on one side and the browser's on one side and the text editor on the other. But if I say the width of the container is 80%, let's do a save, let's do an update, and now what do you think that's 80% of? Keep in mind how we've designed this page now. That container, if I say the container is 80%, it's 80% of the HTML document, which is the entire browser window. Notice by giving it 80% that it has grown as I've grown the browser, so has because I told the header that it's also 80%, it stays at 80% of the browser window. And the container stays at 80% of the browser window, and the header stays at 80% of the container. So as it grows, and this is what we mean by responsive websites. This is what we mean when we say responsive. Because if I make this container 90% of that, save that change, and update, you'll notice now again the container's grown because it's 90% of the available space. And again, as I grow it, it's going to grow. I mean, there's a lot of things we can do here with CSS. I'm just scratching the surface. I'm going to take this back to our 500 pixels, by the way, because that's what I want to do for this demonstration. But it gives you an idea that there's a lot of different ways that we can set this up. Let's do save, refresh. A lot of different ways that we can set this up so that we can get this to portray the way that we want it to portray in that browser window. So far we've taken care of the container and the header. Let's continue. All right, so we've looked at the container. We've looked at the header. Let's go back to our HTML document. The next thing we want to look at is content. And that's actually, this makes up the content of the website. This is the actual content for that particular page. So what I want to do there is I want to go ahead and have that content stand out from the page. And again, separate it from the rest of it because everything still seems all kind of scrunched together. So let's go into our CSS file, as we've been doing. And remember, we want to address the content. So we're looking for an ID of content, and that's what we want to address here. I'm going to go into example 6 in our example or exercise files. I'm going to bring in an ID of content to my CSS file. I'm giving it a background of light gray. By the way, these could be capital or lowercase, but I'm going to give it a background of light gray. I want to make it 95% width, and keep in mind, because the content, again, is inside the container, so it's going to be relative to that container size. So this is going to be 95% of the container itself. And this time I'm going to give it a fixed height because I actually want to get some separation between my content, my header and footer. So I'm going to give it a height of 150 pixels. You normally wouldn't do this. Again, for the demonstration, I'm doing this so you can see what we're doing. Normally you'd let the height be auto because you'd have a lot of information in that content and it would actually push this thing down. So let's go ahead and save that. Again, this would be a great time for you to pause if you need to type this in because you don't have access to the exercise files. I'm going to go ahead and refresh my browser, and you'll notice now I've got this light gray background. I've separated my footer from my header. I've got my text, my content text is actually inside that light gray background. A couple things I'm not comfortable with. Again, I want to get this centered inside my container. And you guessed it, if you guessed that we could do this the same way that we've been doing it for the other two items, you are correct. I can come right below here, and I can put in my margin left and margin right auto. I can save those changes, and it's going to center that content box inside my container, because once again, it's calculating the distance on the right and the left-hand side, and it's giving me a center of it for that. One other thing I want to do is I want to kind of get this away from this header. The text is far too close to the header, but I want to actually push the whole content area down. Not just the text, but the entire content area, and I do that by using margin. And we're going to have a really good tutorial inside the CSS section of the website that talks about the box model, and that's where this is all covered. You really want, that's a great tutorial. You really need to understand the box model if you want to understand how padding and margins impact your areas on your website. But right now, for the demonstration, I'm going to give this a margin of 10. I'm going to save these changes. When I refresh this page now, I should push that context box down 10 pixels from the top. And there we go. Now we've got this nice little 10 pixel border that goes around my content area. And actually, I want to do the same thing at the bottom. So there's a way I could do this at the bottom by just typing margin bottom. And I could do 10 pixels. And again, just as we've done in the top, it's going to actually push the bottom away from the bottom of the content area. So cool. Now the next thing I want to do is I want to get some padding. My text is right up against the top and right against the left edge of this box. I want to push the text down and to the right so that it looks more like it's on a printed page or a piece of paper. And I can do that by using what's called padding. So again, in my content area, I'm going to come down here. I'm going to put padding top 10 pixels and padding left 10 pixels. So it should take my text and move it down 10 pixels and over to the right 10 pixels. Go ahead and save these changes. Refresh my browser. And now you notice that we've got our text has come down and it's gone a little bit into the right. We're still centered. Everything's looking very cool, making a lot of progress. I'm hoping you're beginning to understand the importance of divisions and why they're important in our website design. This is starting to go a little bit long, so I'm going to break this into another section of the tutorial. We're going to go into part 2. And in part 2 of this tutorial series, we're going to continue on where we've left off by looking at the footer section, and then we're going to discuss the new semantic elements in HTML5 and what IDs inside this demonstration site could be replaced with those new semantic elements. So I look forward to seeing you in the next tutorial. I hope you enjoyed the tutorial. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. And again, check out our website,
www.ontargethtml5.com for a complete listing of all the tutorials that are available in the development environment. I look forward to your feedback, and thank you for visiting.